You can't say that you care about black lives. You can't say you care about queer folks and LGBTQ or Palestinians or indigenous or land back or the environment.
Why can't we do that?
You're standing up here taking photos with a genocidal Zionist that's receiving money from AIPAC.
Huh?
See a lot of y'all taking photos with Tim Walz, and you know who you are. You know who you are standing next to this genocidal Zionist.
Oh yeah, I am well aware of who I am. Are you? Or this person, who definitely knows who she is too. Well, in case in all of your self-righteous rage you forgot, I'll remind you, that's Peggy Flanagan, the Ojibwe Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. You know, the person who has personally spearheaded actually giving land back to the tribes. The person who has spent a literal lifetime fighting for and expanding access of tribal rights. A person who also happens to have a hell of a lot of pictures standing up there with Tim Walz. So we'll be sure to inform her that we have it on the excellent authority of some rando pretty boy on the internet that she doesn't actually give a shit about natives' rights. Because obviously, if she gave a shit about natives' rights, she would spend her time waving the flag of a foreign people on the quad at lunchtime rather than getting pictures taken with Tim Walz. But at least you can tell Peggy how much she doesn't care about native rights, unlike this guy who will never be able to tell how much he doesn't care about black lives. You know, on account of him passing away after a lifetime of fighting for civil rights. But if John Lewis were still here, I'm sure you wouldn't hesitate a moment to tell him that he never gave a shit about black people because he took a picture with Tim Walz rather than sitting behind a spray-painted piece of plywood with your specific cause on it. And I'm certain you've already emailed the first trans woman ever elected to the Minnesota House to inform her that she clearly doesn't give a shit about queer folk and their rights. You know, because she's got pictures with Tim Walz, who she worked closely with to get legislation passed to make Minnesota a refuge state for trans people. But if she actually cared, she would have spent her time posting weirdly narcissistic videos on Instagram. But hey, you want to play the game where you get to tell other people what they can and can't and do and don't support based on your big feelings about one issue? Well, we can play that fucking game. Now, there's only two possible outcomes come November, and that's either Trump or Harris will be in the Oval Office. And you either have the most basic understanding of American civics and understand why that is, or you're too fucking ignorant to have any opinion on any geopolitical or socioeconomic issue. But since so many of us, myself included, have explained so many times why it is an objective impossibility in our political structure to have a third-party candidate win, I'm gonna assume that if it is ignorance, it's willful. So with that in mind, you are clearly a homophobic motherfucker, because if you're not voting for the people with a track record of LGBTQ advocacy, then you are helping a person who wants to systematically strip the LGBTQ community of all of their rights. And you can't even pretend to give a shit about natives' rights and land back if instead of voting for the guy who literally gave natives land back, do everything you can to hinder their campaign and by extension help a guy who literally campaigned on pushing a pipeline through Standing Rock. And clearly you don't give a fuck about black lives if you're going to use your time and platform to help get the man elected who met with Kyle Rittenhouse for shooting Black Lives Matter protesters, which is arguably the most mundane thing Trump has done in relation to, you know, any civil rights issue. And while all of that was just being facetious, it's true though, isn't it? You do not actually give a shit about any of those issues. You don't even give a shit about the one issue you actually pretend to give a shit about. Because if you did, you wouldn't be making videos like that or comments like this, picking fights with the people who could actually be allies towards your cause. And you know that. You know that all of these issues are separate issues and none of them negate the others. Yes, the crimes against humanity at the hands of Bibi is a huge issue. But you know what else is a huge fucking issue? Women being stripped of their rights to bodily autonomy, so much so that they are being permanently injured or dying. And you trying to devalue those people's lives, those people's rights, those people's support of the candidates who are going to support them because those candidates may not have the perfect stance on another issue that's important to you is fucking pathetic. And what makes it even more pathetic is you are doing this in an attempt to undermine an administration that has some admittedly bad policy positions on the issue in ultimate favor of an administration that would give Bibi the green light to turn Gaza to glass. But hey, if they all die, it's a small price to pay for you getting to sleep tight knowing you voted your conscience, right? That would be if it mattered to you at all, but it doesn't, because your activism is about one thing: you. In fact, all of these narcissistic pictures you post are a perfect snapshot of what your activism is really about. You want to be out there shirtless with the figurative microphone begging people to pay attention to you. Oh wait, did I say figurative? God, you seem like a lonely fucking person. Which would be fine. I've got no problem with self-absorbed people out there seeking attention for their dopamine fixes. However, I do have a problem with people like you exploiting the very real plights of very real people to do it. Because as you keep reminding us, kids are dying in the Middle East, and you are using those kids' death to get people to pay attention to how many sit-ups you can do. And you're doing it at their expense and at the expense of every single woman who's lost the right to bodily autonomy, at the expense of every child who's going to be forced to carry a child to term, at the expense of the people who are fighting for their land at Standing Rock, at the expense of LGBTQ kids who will be forced to go to conversion therapy, at the expense of desperate immigrants seeking a better life, at the expense of every minority group in this country, at the expense of the environment, at the expense of school children, at the expense of us all. So don't get it twisted. It's you who can't and doesn't give a shit about any of them because you're too busy exploiting them all to get a little bit closer to drowning in your own fucking reflection. So if you can take a moment and try to give a shit about somebody other than yourself, maybe you can realize that the world is a nuanced place full of gray area. And then you can go get an OnlyFans to stroke that incredibly fragile ego of yours and leave the activism to pragmatic people who understand that sometimes taking a shitty step forward for the betterment of everybody is a hell of a lot better than taking a horrendous leap backwards for your ideals, even when it means less people will look at your abs in the process. Have a day.